logical system.
And you're supposed to press it out slowly so that you don't displace the paper filter. Hello and welcome to a new episode of A Coffee for Your Thoughts. I am very happy to get the thoughts of Sabina Leonelli today, a philosopher of science concentrating on biology. Maybe you can share a little bit your background for the people that are not too familiar with philosophy of science.
Of course. So what I do is try to understand how scientists think, how do they actually get to the conclusions they get to, why do we tend to trust and rely on certain methods in science as being something that gives us knowledge we can trust. And in doing that, I do philosophical work, so I really think about the process of reasoning, the kind of concepts people use, the types of models people use, but I also use a lot of empirical research to ground some of these philosophical insights. So I use tools from the history of science and the social studies of science to actually collaborate with researchers on an everyday basis, look at how it is that we get to particular ways of doing research, and also to witness practical ways in which people are really going about doing their research. So it's philosophical work, but it's empirically grounded.
So before we go into your current work and all the wonderful things you're doing, let's maybe go in your personal history. I saw you did a bachelor and a master's of history and philosophy. That combination always seemed to be there. And in your personal history, when was the moment that you decided you want to study philosophy? What triggered you to go that way?
Well, I guess I really was just very interested in everything as a very young person. And I particularly really loved philosophy as a subject. Though we did it at school not very well, so that wouldn't have been my source of inspiration, but I really loved thinking conceptually and articulating arguments and the history of that, especially at that point I was aware of the Western history of that, and at the same time I really loved the sciences. I was fascinated by physics in particular. I really would have liked to study it at the university level. And so when I was trying to pick a degree that I would have wanted to engage in, I tried to look for things that would combine the humanities and physics. And I found these degrees in philosophy and history of science that were being taught in the UK, and I thought that's perfect for me because then I don't have to give up one of the two things I really like.
But you were giving Italy up at the time.
Yeah. So I was just looking around Europe for places where this could be done, and of course now there are programs a bit all over Europe, wonderful colleagues also in Italy who do this, but at that time in Italy doing philosophy really meant doing a lot of philological work, doing a lot of history of philosophy, but much less engagement with contemporary arguments, especially at the graduate level. There wasn't really that much this culture of doing research already at the graduate level. And also there was very little philosophy of science, particularly of applied subjects. There would be maybe some logics and some very formalized philosophy of science, but very little that engaged with the real sciences. So for that we really had to go abroad.
Yes. The irony is I went in the opposite direction. I went to Venice because there the degree was called Scienze Filosofiche, which I already liked that they were packaging it more as science compared to where I was first studying my bachelor in Ghent, where the courses were very personal from the professors and their philosophies basically. We did have another option in Belgium, which is the KU Leuven, and there they were very much into the history of philosophy.
Yeah, of course.
But before we get a very dry mouth, let's say, I'll offer you this decaffeinated coffee that I roasted yesterday. I did not have the chance yet to taste it myself. Roasting decaffeinated coffee is always a little bit more challenging than normal coffee. So I would say cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for the coffee.
Okay, I'm personally already pleased with the coffee. Sometimes decaffeinated coffees, when I roast them, they give me kind of a cardboard brown sugary flavor, which is here a little bit in the background. So we get to enjoy this actually. So usually when I start a podcast, I want to start out with some general philosophy questions also. the one I asked in the last episode was, of the Trinity in philosophy, we have Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, and my gut feeling says that you would side most of all with Aristotle, but correct me if I'm wrong, who's your favorite of the three and why?
Oh gosh, that's difficult, but I would say, yeah, probably would be Aristotle. Not so much questions about prime motors, but of course this attention to the details of the natural life around us and to natural history, which actually powered a lot of Aristotle's then thoughts about causality and about epistemology and ontology in the world. I think that's something that we share in sensibility. So I've always been fascinated by biology. I very quickly realized that actually rather than focusing on physics, I wanted to focus more on the biological world when I was doing my studies as an undergraduate and then later on in the PhD. And so, yeah, this fascination with literally the wonder of nature, and particularly botanical nature, so the studies of plants for me is
which
very
Aristotle was torches. His works were actually lost on that, so somebody else is a little bit seen as the father of taxonomy, but it was thanks to Aristotle's work, also for marine biology. Did you know that Aristotle was one of the first kind of academic free divers to really go and dive?
No, I didn't know this.
And observe the sea life and make comparisons and classifications, which we'll get back in the book because of course that's a big part. Of course, now I'm naming three men, which...
But yeah, I mean, let's say one could say more about where philosophy comes from, and I'm not sure I would start with Aristotle, but
Yes, but so if you can name
important figures.
three female philosophers from the history of science.
From the history of science or the history of philosophy?
The history of philosophy, yes.
Alright, three female philosophers from the history of philosophy. I mean, certainly Hannah Arendt, for me, has been an influence and continues to be. Yeah, I mean, just picking three is a bit hard.
Yes, it's easier with Socrates, Plato and Aristotle because they're always mentioned together.
Yeah, that's very true. So, I mean, probably Simone de Beauvoir, like in terms of thinking through also broader social questions around the role of women in society and how we relate to questions of gender. Let's see. I would pick somebody more recent, Helen Longino, and her work on contextual empiricism and pluralism. For me, has been very, very inspirational. I see a lot of the work I do as being, I wouldn't dare to say a continuation, but certainly on relying on many of the insights that she started to push in philosophy of science.
Yeah, actually for preparing, because last time in the first podcast I didn't ask this question and I kind of realized I have kind of a gender bias in this first question, so that's why I had this follow-up question. And I did research like throughout history, although it's a little bit like in the arts that a lot of women having worked in this field are a little bit looked over, despite the fact that they were actually working on these topics. And for example, the teacher of Pythagoras was, now I forgot her name, but his principal teacher was actually a female philosopher. Well, she was a priest in Delhi, but I mean, back then those two things were still somewhat mixed. You can go even to 1000 before Christ, and in the Indian Veda traditions, there are also female philosophers. So it's something that we, I think, also need to talk about more about in the history of philosophy.
Absolutely, but also with men.
Yes, but of course, men have tried to cancel some of those histories. This is kind of a little problem. And actually, we can relate this to something that is being discussed in your book already, the case of Rosalind Franklin. The reason I bring it up, so I work in the Botanic Garden of Mesa, and I'm also part there of the Gender Commission, so we try to look around how we can improve science, attracting also women to want to study biodiversity, biology. And we also go around our garden, and we have this educational greenhouse where the history of life on our planets is presented, and then they come to evolution, and they say the fathers of evolution, and they show, of course, Darwin, but then also Watson and Crick, and they call really the fathers of history, and they don't mention Rosalind Franklin at all. Which
there'll be many other female scientists mentioned there.
Yes.
Barbara McLean took to many others.
Yes, exactly. But if you would consider, because you can still debate this, Whether Watson and Crick should be considered fathers of the evolutionary theory and not just Darwin, because they rather explained the genetic codes rather maybe than evolution, although that's the mechanism over which we then had evolution. But if you would consider them fathers, you would definitely consider Rosalind Franklin the mother of evolution theory and of those kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say probably I really detest the kind of fathers of, mothers of kind of approach, so that wouldn't be at all my way of thinking, so that's why it's a bit difficult for me to answer this question, because that's just not
but I
the way I would think about this.
We're changing that. We're changing that.
Indeed. So, I mean, you know, and the ways in which the history of genetics intersects with the history of evolutionary biology is also not obvious, because in fact, at several points of that history, the two things went to some extent separate ways, right? Because one history was about trying to understand the kind of basic kind of physical mechanisms that would enable reproduction, and therefore, of course, variation and selection. So it was, of course, connected to evolutionary thinking on a broader scale, but the attention was different from the attention of people that were trying to understand on a macro scale how do we theorize reproduction, selection, and the evolution of life and development of life on the planet, right? So, I mean, given that premise, if one wants to put this genetic together with evolutionary, the evolution of evolutionary thought, then yes, I mean, I think Rosalind Franklin did play an important role, as many other people, particularly in thinking about RNA and kind of structures which are different to DNA, but in fact we now know to be ever more fascinating and playing potentially an equally important, if not even more important role in gene expression and development, which are so fundamental to, in fact, what we look like and how we behave as organisms. So in that sense, certainly the research that she did was really, really important. I mean, one of the reasons why Rosalind Franklin gets sidetracked, even aside from what we can say on the social level about the relationship that she would have had with people like Francis Crick and Jim Watson, is the fact that she was working on crystallography. And she was working on crystallography from a very technical perspective, or what seemed to be a more technical perspective. So really trying to get good pictures of crystallographic structures at a micro level, think about what these pictures may mean, think about the structures they would encompass. And so, you know, this kind of work may be misunderstood, it's very often misunderstood even now, to be work which is just, you know, it's just about the techniques, just about the methods, it's not really asking deep questions. Of course, we now, I think, have more sophisticated philosophy of science that allows us to be much more careful about making these divides. People who come up with deep theoretical frameworks to try and explain some of these images and some of the techniques, like the results of some of these techniques, in fact may be just as significant in the work, just as important as people who are making it possible to have the technological advancements and the kind of technical know-how to produce these images. I mean, it requires a huge amount of conceptual background, of expertise, and in fact, asking those questions, though they're not articulated in the same way. So I think she's a very good example of somebody who was very, very good at applying certain techniques, in fact inventing them in the first place, to try and visualize, make it possible for us to even imagine what RNA and DNA structures would look like, and less well-versed, less encouraged maybe also, or simply just less interested in formalizing and articulating the thoughts that underpinned that work in a way that people would immediately recognize as theory, which in fact people like Jim Dodson and Francis Crick were very good at doing. So I think it's a good example of different skills and expertises that go into the development of science and scientific discovery, but also the different ways in which we evaluate those skills and the different visibility they have in the contemporary world.
Yeah, I think this focus on the technical efforts being put in and the relevance to science is a very important thread theme that is in the book, so I should actually formally introduce it. Data-centric biology, a philosophical study. You actually made this in 2016?
It was published in 2016, yeah, it was written between 2000, well, it took me 10 years, but finished in 2014 or so.
And the title, the data-centric, that is kind of in opposition to that hypothesis driven, trying to get the bird-eyes view and explaining science, right? This is the idea
exactly.
behind that.
So the idea is both in opposition to the idea that anything drives anything else in science. So the idea being that we're not really thinking about theory or data driving scientific research, but rather we're thinking about how humans who develop those theories and develop the data may center their attention in doing research. So the idea is this is not data driven, but it's data centric. But at the same time, wanted to take seriously the fact that we are now looking more and more at situations in research where what drives the attention of scientists is not necessarily immediately asking a particular theoretical question, but is the opportunities and the possibilities to create data sets that may document or represent somehow particular phenomena. And this has a different epistemic structure to purely hypothesis-driven research, where the idea is, well, I'm curious, I have this question, I find a way to operationalize the asking of that question, and then I just do my research to try and answer the question.
Okay, maybe we can do a small step backwards for the general public in just explaining what is data. What's like somebody that is not a scientist or a philosopher, how should they think about or consider data?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody is by now very aware of the idea of data, much more than maybe 15 years ago when I started to do a lot of this work, because data are discussed all over our society, and everybody is aware of the fact that whenever they use social media or whenever they use a credit card, then some information about themselves and their behavior, which we may call data, is stored, is collected, is retained, is circulated. People in the banking system or insurance system or friends and family or people further flung away may actually be able to view that information and utilize it for their own purposes. So you would think about data as objects of many different types. It can be material objects, it can be digital objects that are taken to have a function, at least potentially to function as evidence about something, whether that something is a claim or a person or a particular action. So it's something that I can use as evidence to actually strengthen that particular or inform that particular action or belief, if you want. Now, one of the interesting things about discussing data in contemporary society is that often they get seen as the ultimate empirical fact, right? So very often people put the idea of fact on the same line as data, and they say, okay, data are the stuff that we give for granted, right? It's the stuff that we know to be true.
The raw stuff.
Exactly. And a lot of my work has been trying to demonstrate that this is not a very good way to think about data, that in fact what we take to be true, the facts, are a particular elaboration, a particular interpretation of certain data sets that have been clustered, that have been ordered, and been processed and modeled to have that particular valence, that particular meaning. And so data, in fact, can be interpreted in all sorts of different ways. They have different characteristics, we can use them for a variety of purposes. And it's how we use the data, how we model them, how we actually interpret them, that gives us facts about the world, that may or may not be true, depending on how good our interpretation is. This is not something that is intrinsic to the data.
So the fact that you don't have raw data in that sense, is it because you would say that you would almost automatically, initially, already categorize your data within the effort in which you're generating it, so that you would always have data and metadata from the very beginning, and the metadata can further expand, or you see it differently?
So, I mean, I think, let's just give some examples, because otherwise I think already the metadata people may not be familiar with. So, the idea is that, first of all, data are obviously produced in situations which are not scientific, right? So, if you think about scientific data, you may think somebody who does an experiment in the lab, analyzing certain cells, for instance, in a petri dish, photographs them, plots them, takes measurements. All those photographs and measurements and various bits of information that you extract from the cell, this will be data, right? I think everybody will be on board with that. But actually, when I go around town with my mobile and I take pictures of trees or plants I like, these are also data that I'm producing, these pictures. And the information that comes with the pictures, something like the time at which it has been taken, the location at which it has been taken, which very often get recorded by our mobile phones, this will be what we call technically metadata. So this is information about the data, right? So the idea here is to say, well, of course this data has particular characteristics. If I take a picture of a tree outside, it's going to have a very particular shape. It's not going to be a picture of a cat. It's not going to be a picture of a tiger. It's a picture of a tree. It gives me certain information for sure and not other. Right? But the ways in which I may or may not use that picture as evidence, where really that picture becomes data for me in the sense that it becomes something that I can use as evidence for something else, that depends, at least in part, on the context in which I'm asking questions. So, if I'm taking pictures of a tree because I really like elms, for instance, and I decide that wherever I am in the world, if I see an elm, I take a picture and then I have a nice collection in my phone of different elms that I've seen in different parts of the world. This is a nice collection of pictures, but it's not data. It's not something that I'm using because I'm trying to prove something or I'm researching something. It's simply a nice set of pictures that I took because I found aesthetic pleasure in it. But it could be that I have a friend who is a botanist, who is also studying elms, and is interested, for instance, in elm diseases, and discovers that I have this collection of pictures and says, oh, but this could give me interesting information about how elms develop and what the morphology is in different parts of the world, because you have such a nice collection of pictures. Now, in the hands of somebody who's asking particular questions about these images, the images become data. They're put to use towards a particular goal. You wouldn't be able to pick up a picture of a cat to do the same function, right? So it has to have certain characteristics which are contextual. But the fact is, it's not the fact that I have a picture of an elm that determines which meaning I will give to that picture. It's the context in which you put it that ultimately allows you to have some sort of interpretation that may make sense.
So the context in which you put it is then again kind of metadata labels that you would attach to it then? Or
Well, I mean, so the context is a context of use. So of course you can attach information to data, but when you do that, it's always because you imagine a particular use. It's not that the metadata per se are being used, right? It's the fact that, okay, if I want to use these pictures of a tree to investigate the spread of a particular plant disease, then one important metadata for me would be the color of the leaves, for instance, because this disease affects the leaves of the plants. If I don't think about that parameter, if I have pictures that don't show this clearly, then those pictures are useless to me because I'm not going to be able to research what I want to do. So if you decide to have a data collection where that particular piece of metadata, the color of the leaves, is highlighted as information that all these pictures have to show somehow, now of course you've set up your data collection for a particular use. You can do this in a variety of different ways. So what I'm trying to point out is not that the data just come with some sort of automatic metadata and then that will determine uses, but rather when you create a data collection, when you curate it, when you process it in particular ways, you make choices about which aspects of, say, these pictures will be highlighted and which not. And in fact, you select the data on that respect also. Right? And this will in turn open up certain ways of using the data and close down others. So it's not just a question of thinking about the data and the metadata as something that, if you want, comes ready-made and then people can pass by and that's all the context they need to ask any question. It's more a question of thinking, well, whenever you're trying to use data for a particular purpose, what is the nature of that context? What kind of assumptions are you making conceptually? What assumptions are you making about the materials that you're using? How familiar are you, say, with the plants that you're interested in which world location are you working? And given those contextual aspects, thinking, okay, can these data, the way they're being presented and curated, the information that they come with, be useful to you in that context of research?
So this is covered a lot in the first chapter, making data travel, I would say. And it actually, as I was reading the book, I had to think about the FAIR principles, because first it's kind of findable, And then in the second one, you talk also a lot about the importance of open data, and you're an advocate for open data.
No, not really.
Not really? Okay. But it is about also getting it accessible, getting all the data together so that this kind of research can be done. Actually, it's interesting that you're not necessarily an advocate of open data. Maybe you can explore on that. And I have a question also around data and how data is being collected in the current times by one of my colleagues who's interested to know on your vision. In the past, data was not considered as something copyrightable. Whereas now, if you put efforts in how you set up collecting data, suddenly you get data rights. So maybe you can share your thoughts on open data on the one hand and people making these kind of claims that until I think a decade ago was just not on the table. How did this happen? Was there a lot of lobbying to get this way? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing?
Yeah, okay, so that's a huge question, so I'll take it in stages. So first of all, I don't know that people have any clue about what fair data would be, so let me just explain very briefly. These are principles through which people end up thinking about how to share data. The idea is that it would have to be findable some way, so that they have to be tagged, so that if you do a search on the internet, you would actually be able to locate data sets that are of interest to you and to the questions you want to ask. They need to be accessible, so that if you actually want to see the data and work with them, you can do that. They need to be interoperable, meaning that regardless of which standard you use, which software you use, like which kind of tools you use, you can in fact work with certain data sets. It's possible to do so, which is a very complicated requirement. And they have to be reusable. So all of those things makes it possible then for people to pick up the data and repurpose them for their own goals and their own interests. Now, part of the reasons why people have thought a lot about these FAIR principles is the fact that actually opening up data just like that is almost meaningless and very problematic, right? So in that sense, I'm definitely not an advocate of open data, and the less so, the more I go on. Because very often it just means slapping stuff on the internet and putting a lot of objects, information on the internet in ways which are not particularly well processed. In fact, they're not particularly interoperable with anything else. They're not really reusable. They're very, very hard to reuse. And in fact, don't help anybody. It's just flooding the information sphere with a lot of objects that in fact are really intractable. Right? So open data understood in that sense is really problematic. It's problematic in terms of just producing potentially a lot of really kind of uninterpretable information, kind of meaningless information. It's problematic because, of course, all of this storing information and disseminating information has a cost, and also an environmental cost, so a lot of this is actually expensive to run. And it's problematic because a lot of the data that are actually shared are data that document or are taken from particular communities, particular realities that are sensitive. And so there are real concerns around, and of course the obvious case is personal medical data, but there's so many others. So the questions really become, is it in fact right to share data in the first place? And how do we make sure that this is done in a way that's intelligent, so that actually you only share things that in fact can be properly used, and you also focus on the conditions of reuse and what actually is meaningful reuse. I mean, maybe not every reuse of data is something you want to support, right? So in that sense, there's been a lot of work which I participated in, also on the back of writing that book and a couple of others after, on thinking about, well, what does it mean to work with data intelligently so you can share the data that actually need to be shared, but most importantly, you get the research done that you want to do without harming people that may be involved in such research. For instance, when in this kind of so-called extractive operations, where a lot of data that people just who use any mobile phone may be, without quite knowing, feeding into their online system just by interacting with their phone and providing lots of information to their phone, but that may be exploited, for instance, by insurance companies or by retailers or kind of publicity exactly, in fact kind of trying to affect their behavior in a way that these people may not necessarily want, or once they're aware of this, become to really resent. Right? So how do we break this cycle of sharing all this data in ways that actually becomes either meaningless and environmentally damaging or actually socially damaging in a big way. So one of the ways in which people have thought about this is in fact to think whether data need to be shared at all. And this is what we mean by working on data governance, which is a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment. What does it mean to do responsible data governance? There's lots of ways in which people can use data without sharing them. So you can actually run algorithms through particular data sets in a way that doesn't require you to actually share the data, but can still allow you to work with them and actually get meaningful information out of them, for instance. There are ways in which you can regulate access, so you can actually have mediating bodies that make decisions about who should be trusted with the data and who shouldn't, and for which purpose. Very often that's what happens in biomedical repositories, where there is some decision making around who is in fact able to access certain data about particular patients, why, and whether it's okay for those patients, would it be harmful or beneficial that this kind of repurposes is done. Right? So, now, all of this is happening in a space where, as you were saying, data trading and kind of the circulation of data has not until very recently come to the attention of intellectual property rights discussions. And so there's been a lot of freedom and also a lot of confusion, particularly in relation to research data, around whether data can be owned or not. What does it mean to own data? And what does it mean particularly when you're working in academically funded research? And so the imperative there is to try and make that data as accessible as possible, but still there are costs to producing the data. There's a lot of confusion around what that means in terms of your own ownership of the data. Now, I'm not particularly in favor personally of having ownership regimes of any type applying to data, but of course we are in a highly commodified environment where whenever you circulate data, there is always going to be a chance, very often it happens, that somebody who's working in a private company appropriates the data for their own use and actually makes it invisible, so applies copyright or trademark regime to data or some sort of licensing after they've been produced, so even after they've been put in the public sphere, with the idea that now they're literally appropriating the data and using them for their own purposes. And this is clearly something that is very problematic, because it ends up making really invisible a lot of data landscape that we're playing with.
Is this happening a lot in the AI landscape? Or
yes, I mean it was happening a lot before the advent of foundational AI. Now it makes it even more complex, the advent of certain forms of AI, because they're building on so many different data sets and data sources from around the world, very often just mined through the internet, in ways that are not very transparent, not even to their developers. And so it's actually becoming ever more difficult to track which data sources any particular AI model has used to create the results. And so these questions around who owns that data becomes completely moot, because you don't even know which data being used to train the system that you're using, right? So that creates a lot of complications. But let's say there is a big fight at the moment going on, lots of discussions around how data should be trademarked or licensed, so that we have a situation where if you want to make a certain data set open, because you decide that there are no risks attached to it, that this is going to be the best for humanity for all sorts of reasons, then you can do it through a license that prevents other people from appropriating that data set once it's out in the open. And so in that sense, a very interesting discussion, which is still definitely unresolved. How do you copyright certain data sets? My feeling is also that, already that idea of applying intellectual property to data sets kind of assumes the idea that you can in fact own them, that there are these assets that can be retained or reused in particular ways. I think this is not something we take for granted. I mean, there's lots of data sets that one could arguably consider to be common goods, to be something which is so precious to humanity, something that is being produced to publicly funded research, and really is potentially helpful to so many different ways in which we understand the world, that it shouldn't be owned just by a particular group. It should be actually made available to those who may need it for particular purposes, but in a way that is, in that sense, open, right? Which is not restricted by specific questions about ownership in the narrow sense.
But I guess at the current time, those laws are more restrictive than, for example, patents, also in time. Wasn't it more like 3 years that they could claim the ownership of data sets? Or
well, I mean, there's really no obvious solution to data trademarking at the moment. There's lots and lots of different potential legal formulas. They're valid in different systems, different forms. Actually, there's no generalizing about this at the moment.
Okay.
And these things are not consistently applied and enforced either. So we're very, very at the beginning of trying to enforce legal tools around copyrighting data. So in fact, it's very much an evolving situation, I would say. It's hard to generalize now.
Okay, so now we have basically all the data and it's already kind of annotated and being shared. And then you also go ahead in how between different communities they can make it intelligible for each other. And I would say this is the point that ontologies become important, but that's a very complicated word, ontology. So maybe you can explain it within philosophical tradition first and how it became used actually for this kind of data producers and data consumers.
Yeah, I think the philosophical tradition is just a remote inspiration for some of the discussions that are happening in computational science. So only the general idea was picked up, but really the two things don't have much in common anymore. So of course, the philosophical tradition of ontology is to ask questions around what is there in the world, what are the assumptions we're making about what exists. And that's the tradition that has come to us, going through Plato, through like many of the most important philosophers have handled that question. Now, within the context of data science and computational science, that question is asked in relation to what do we assume are the things, the phenomena, the kind of the things in the world that we want to know about by studying the data. Which of course is also a question around what are the keywords that we use to investigate the data. So, what are the things I'm interested in? If I'm a scientist and I'm interested in why this plant has this particular trait, then that trait could be a keyword for me. I want to know leaf shape. I want to kind of use the word leaf shape as a keyword for my database search. And this will give me information, possibly, hopefully, about leaf shape. So this becomes a term in my ontology, if you want. So it's much less about really asking deep questions about what there is in the world, and it becomes much more a way of organizing your data collections. How do you structure them? How do you classify the data? So that eventually they can be searchable and you can use keywords to retrieve whatever data set you're interested in. So this is what we call computational ontologies, in biology and biontologies, and really the system of keywords, some people would call them the semantic infrastructure of databases, which we use to organize data, to order them, and to be able to label them with keywords so that we can eventually make them retrievable. Of course, using these ontologies within databases is very significant because you're basically making a judgment on which phenomena this data may be useful to understand. Right? So, in a sense, you are both making it possible to use the data, to search for them and use them to ask a particular question, but you're also restricting the range of questions that you could ask in the first place by associating data to a particular set of items and not others. Right?
So in case you might be a little bit stuck in a vicious circle in some way, you might already have done a lot of experiments giving you insights. Based on those insights you start to classify your data, but you then might be kind of stuck in a circle. Is that a good way?
Well, yeah, I mean, and this is why thinking about classification has always been a big part of science, and classifications are by definition revisable, right? There's something that needs to be stable enough that you can still use them to communicate with others, to exchange materials, but they need to be constantly revised and challenged and updated so they keep up, not just with the knowledge that we have, but with the knowledge that we want to acquire. So they allow us to ask new questions as we go along.
Actually, let me use this opportunity to hint back to Aristotle, who really started classifying the biosphere in a lot of different ways. And there is a recent paper doing a statistical analysis between how Aristotle classified the marine organisms and how Linnaeus classify the marine organisms, showing that in some regards Aristotle was even doing a better step than Linnaeus so many centuries later. So Aristotle is, in the first part, always seen as a philosopher, but I kind of see him as a scientist. Would you call him also a scientist and a philosopher, or you still see him just as a philosopher? Because in your book, you pay a lot of attention to classification and how this is really part of science, and you hint also to Linnaeus' work. So how are your feelings or opinions on this topic?
Well, I think just historically, all of these figures lived at a time where there was not such distinction, right? So natural philosophy was philosophy and it was science at the same time. This is something that, the distinction between these disciplines have come much, much later, towards the end of the 19th century, where we started to really divide up disciplines because there was more and more knowledge available, people needed to specialize in different realms, and so we've gotten to the hyper-specialized division of disciplines and fields that we have now. So I think for people like Linnaeus and Aristotle, it really doesn't make sense to pigeonhole them as philosophers or scientists, because those categories would have made no sense to them at the time, and it would have made perfect sense to think about their work as having both very strong conceptual components and very strong observational, empirical and experimental components, and the two things would have gone together. Now, I would argue that for a lot of the best scientists at the moment, this is actually similar. So you have a component to your work, even if you're an experimentalist, that is very conceptual. You really are thinking deeply about which notions you adopt, how do you give meaning to certain words that you're using, what are the kind of background theories you would endorse or challenge in your work. And so all of that is a very strongly theoretical component to your work, and that includes the classifications that you may choose to use. But of course, there's also very empirical components to your work, which are, the very particular methods of observation, how you're going to go out in the field and write out what you see, how you're going to measure a particular phenomena, which are, if you want, something that we associate now much more with scientific work than with more theoretical, philosophical work. My intuition generally is that these two parts of scientific work go together, and in fact that all of them always involve a philosophical component, where we understand philosophy broadly as conceptual decisions about how we articulate our knowledge and how we think about reality. And of course, in the experimental sciences, this is maybe sometimes less prominent, is less clearly articulated, because also there's this intuition that you want to make them sometimes look as if, your conclusion just came out of the data magically, which I think is a big problem. And in the more theoretical sciences, I guess people are more prone to acknowledge the fact that these are much more, they're in a blurred line with philosophy, because you're trying to resolve deep conceptual questions at that level. So if you do foundational theoretical physics, the boundaries between that and working philosophy physics are relatively blurred. If you're doing foundational evolutionary theory, again, it's well acknowledged that the boundaries between that and philosophy of biology would be relatively blurred. I would claim that similar things could be said of experimental biology and experimental physics. It's just that it's less apparent, because we've grown up in a system where many of us have been educated to distinguish, philosophy is that thing where people talk about things very much in the abstract,
that you
in a way that's
prove.
completely detached from the world, and science is that thing where in fact you're trying to prove some facts, and this is the standard to which you're held. I mean, my idea is that in fact philosophy and science interact and are in dialogue all the time. Philosophy can be useful to ask empirically reliable questions and can actually help you to think, what are you doing when you're producing knowledge in a reliable sense? And at the same time, science can really help you to refine your philosophical questions and create new ones.
But as your work as a philosopher of science, the scientists are kind of your field of study. So you're scientists at a meta level in this sense, trying to figure out historically how is it evolving, how are they adapting to new situations, and in this case, getting this big data.
Agreed. So there is certainly an asymmetry which is built into the nature of the field. We're not just philosophy of something. So of course, ultimately, I am professionally interested in interacting with scientists, understanding how they work, in a way that is not reciprocal. I mean, a scientist doesn't necessarily have to engage me because they want to understand philosophically how the world works. Of course, part of the arguments I'm typically making with researchers and the ways in which I work is to make this work as collaborative as possible. And so what I've found over the years is that, of course, ultimately, I have an interest in writing books and articles where I analyze scientific practices and their implications. But in the course of doing this work, sometimes me and many colleagues come up with insights that in fact can be useful to science itself. So people like Azok Chang has called this complementary science, and the idea is that you can actually support scientific efforts by in fact doing philosophical work. And so a lot of the relationships I have now with researchers, scientists on the ground, tend to take the shape of collaborations, not just me going in and study them, but actually working with them to try to understand better their own research fields. And some of my outputs and the ways in which I think may be a little bit weird for them, and they maybe not be as interested unless they're actually very interested in philosophy. But other insights that come out of philosophy may be directly useful to the ways in which they're working. For instance, when we were working on ontologies, it became very clear that it was difficult for people working on these ontologies to communicate to biologists that the ontologies need to change, they need to be maintained, they require a lot of work to be updated, because it's actually very difficult to do so. While people that were working in biology and just accessing databases thought, well, this stuff will be for granted. I mean, it is what it is, it's factual knowledge, it's not a problem. So one of the interesting things for me was to, as I was doing my work in thinking about how these ontologies were conceptually structuring the data work, I also made it maybe a bit easier for people who were doing that work to talk about their own work and to show other biologists why it was important to take it seriously conceptually. Because it became clear, like also through some of the philosophical work, that this is really foundational, conceptually foundational work for a lot of data-intensive science.
Yes. So the biologists in this example are kind of the experimentalists, the ones that are doing the experiments, and then the ones that are determining the ontology terms, they would more be the database curators.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of more data scientists, people maybe come from bioinformatics and biology, but are more busy with dealing with the data side than with the experiment side. Yeah.
It's this part in your book that I personally really appreciated, because I started my academic career doing bioinformatics.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes, and actually it ties back to the coffee that you have been drinking here. I'm jumping a little bit because you're also talking a lot about journeys and how data travels, and so in my kind of traveling, starting as a bioinformatician, I just had to analyze forensic data, which was basically just getting the fingerprints, and so there was not a lot of biology involved. And during that time, I did get to work with a lot of other PhD students that were doing more wet lab, as we would say, doing experiments in the laboratory. One of those studies was on Artemisia annua, a plant that produces an anti-malaria drug. So I got to analyze that data set because I was doing the bioinformatics. This is a little bit the context. The bioinformatics is a bottleneck. You end up working with a lot of other people, helping them out, but you don't really have a claim on the results. You're like a necessary piece, but you don't really control what's going to happen. And I was very grateful because I had a very objective way of looking at it. I was like, I don't care what the topic is, because I actually came from having studied 5 years of philosophy. So I was like, I did bioengineering before, so I was 5 years in the middle. So I was happy just programming and trying to get this result and focusing on statistics. So from my point of view, I was like, I will abstract, it should just be pure facts, you could say, pure raw data and seeing statistical relationships. But then I didn't really have an impact on the end results. And then later I moved in the direction of doing more biology-focused work, working on cancer. So I kind of left this laboratory behind and I ended up in the laboratory very focused on one topic, neuroblastoma, pediatric cancer. And I had my own bioinformatics project to work out, making new algorithms, but I again kind of ended up having to do a lot of work with the other students, helping them out, just getting the data processed. So then I moved again, basically, and in me this feeling started to grow that when I'm not generating data, I never have like a say what happens with my contribution, how my contribution is made. So this is how I ended up with coffee.
Right.
Deciding I'll roast my own coffee and I'll, keep that data. So for the moment I still don't have that open data because of this personal journey that I kind of went through. But at the other side, I also experienced this importance of really going through laboratories, working with people. You get this kind of tacit knowledge that you also mentioned that you don't really get if you're just studying other people's work and papers. So this is my, how I ended up, this is how this coffee ended up. So this was kind of my own personal journey, and I started working with data and trying to collect the data myself. And I don't really know how it should go forward, like with opening up this data and who should control it. I do try actually to get already a little bit of metadata. So this is the caffeinated coffee. So as you don't drink caffeinated coffee, I have for you the decaffeinated.
Thank you very much.
The irony was, I still had the green beans because green coffee stays good for 2 years. But I didn't have it in my database, so I don't have the metadata on this coffee. You just get it like this. Actually, we should just have a small check how far it is. We still have time.
Yeah, I think we still have 15
an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm making new barcodes to connect this with each coffee that I roast, so that in theory I could then link it to how people are experiencing the coffee, what their taste profiles are. So I'm trying to work on building these data sets, and I hope of course to open it up as much as possible, but I'm trying to be careful. Again, also if you have customers, you cannot just share their taste profiles, because it might tell a lot about people as well. Yes, just like in decaf coffee is actually very good. There's this kind of meta-studies that is showing that the coffee seems to have a health benefits. There's interesting cases about coffee in the history of science, because before they thought that it had a negative impact on health, and that was because they didn't check for the correlation between people drinking coffee and smoking. So in the earlier studies they thought, coffee is bad for you. But when they progressing insight, and now they're kind of correcting for that, and they see in general up to 5 cups of coffee gives you actually a health benefit, but when they compare people consuming caffeine and no caffeine, that doesn't make a difference. So whenever you feel good, drinking either caffeinated or decaffeinated, it's actually perfect. So this was now just a small intermezzo on the coffee, which we should also discuss. But we can get back to the conclusion of all your work that you've done here, and how this links to your current work. How has this formed you as a philosopher, a scientist? Because for me you are a philosopher and a scientist. And how has this shaped your current work?
Right, so I think quite a lot of the questions that I asked in that book ended up expanding in 2 ways. One is by actually looking at more diverse research environments, so looking at things like environmental science, crop science, horticultural science, and public health. So I ended up being very interested in expanding my field of vision to basically research that speaks to health-environment interactions. And so that has taken a lot of work, and it's taken me on very interesting collaborations that were a bit different from the ones that are in that book, which are mostly within biology proper, and especially bioinformatics, a lot of omics research, that kind of thing. So that's one thing. The other is, because in that book I raised lots of issues around inequity and potential social problems raised by the distribution of data.
That's Data and Society? Is that the other book?
No, I'm talking about this one. So I ended up doing a lot of work, and I'm still doing, and a lot of research on questions of inequity and injustice in the research landscape. What kind of research incentives should be used to actually produce research that is both more resilient and robust in terms of its findings, but also more responsible in terms of its social roles. And so that ended up into a variety of different outputs so far. So indeed I published a series of works on data journeys and data in society, so looking more at the role of data in a much broader sense in society, the implications of conceptualizing them in particular ways. And I've done a lot of work on open science and what does it mean to think about openness. At the conference I'm attending now, I was talking about these questions and thinking about how can we implement ideas of openness and open research and open scrutiny, while at the same time respecting the fact that a lot of scientific materials in fact are sensitive, that we live in a very unequal environment where it's very, very easy for people to get exploited. So how do we maintain this idea of openness and critical scrutiny, but at the same time, take account of the fact that we live in a very unequal environment with lots of geopolitical challenges, where communication across nations is certainly no longer, but it's never really been easy, but even the illusion that this was easy is now disappearing very rapidly, especially given what's going on with the Trump administration in the US. So these are the kind of questions we're asking now, and we're doing this through, again, a lot of collaboration with scientists around the world. So I have collaborations around Europe, in Italy, in Greece, and the UK, and in Germany, but also in Brazil, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in other environments, trying to document as much as possible differences and different opportunities that may arise when you're working in very different research environments. And also we are doing quite a lot of work to try and bring different types of scientific expertise to be recognized as, in fact, having scientific value within academia. And so I'm now directing this entity called the Public Science Lab, which I've just started to do very recently, where we're trying to bring all those different experiences of trying to construct responsible science together with a variety of different people, and really think about what the purpose of data use is when you're sharing data, and really in confrontation with each other, so that we can offer our expertise as philosophers engaged in these questions to people who are really asking these questions on an everyday basis to try and resolve urgent social problems. I am a farmer who's trying to decide whether or not I want to share my data through a particular digital tool. I am a physician who is trying to think whether I trust this particular AI application which is giving me certain results about my patients, right? These are all practical problems. They have very deep philosophical underpinnings, and what I'm really engaged in now, I'm interested in, is trying to make sure that the philosophical insights we have about these problems go to people that may in fact make use of it, which I also find to be very generative as a philosopher, because of course that keeps raising new questions and new problems that then I can get my teeth into.
For the next decade.
Exactly, hopefully, if I'm still there, yes.
Now it's interesting, actually, I also work on European projects around biodiversity, also for policy use. So one is safeguarding biodiversity for policymakers. And then we also have B Cubed, which is a project where we're actually trying to package biodiversity data, which also has sensitivity issues. I mean, you wouldn't imagine it, but there are people stealing plants or stealing whatever thing. There's these markets, and even more unfortunate, I would think, animals, but even cactuses. So whatever we're doing, we're trying to get this global insights of what's happening with biodiversity, but we also have to be very careful with whom we're sharing this information. So our solution is trying to already package it with this kind of sensitivity built in. So that's what we're doing in this B Cubed project. So you have a lot of attention also to plant science and the difficulties in funding plant science, basically. It has been improving a little bit, is my feeling. Or
well, it depends. I mean, it certainly is also the case if you want to study plant sciences from the philosophical and social science perspective, it's very, very hard to achieve. I mean, it's not something, I mean, I think there's still a perception that projects in biomedicine deserve much more attention because they're more obviously related to human health than projects in agriculture and in plant science. I think that's still very much the case. I think it's very much of a pity because obviously we breathe plants, we breathe without plants, like they provide the main source of our food, they provide the main ways in which we actually can manage our environment, even in terms of actually getting the soil to hold in a moment where a lot of parts of the world are flooded. So there's lots and lots of different ways in which plants are directly relevant to human health. I would say, sure, I mean, there are ways in which certain parts of more agriculturally oriented work are well funded. I would say that there's still a huge imbalance between, for instance, funding work that's very obviously omics driven, so you just sequence lots of stuff in the natural world, and this will give you elements where you can modify certain traits, whether through traditional breeding or genetically modified traits, and this will get you better plants that we can then commercialize and sell as being the best variety you can possibly cultivate. This is very much the Green Revolution kind of approach to agricultural development and sustainability. But the alternative approaches, which are much more focused on trying to understand in an integrative way what the physiology of certain plants is like, how do they develop under particular environmental conditions, how important the diversity of plants is also to food production. All of those questions are less funded, they're less obviously usable within a highly commercialized agro-business environment around the world, where the tendency is to basically commercialize certain kinds of seeds and we sell it all over the place, at least to the right environments. And so I think a lot of the questions that I'm interested in plant science are still woefully underfunded compared to approaches that just give for granted that as long as you have genetic diversity, you basically capture diversity in the plant world. And I don't think that that's the case. So there's always hope that this will change, but at the moment I think it's still unbalanced.
Fingers crossed for the European Green Deal, that it continues the way it has been continuing, that we get more opportunities to.
But exactly,
who knows?
There.
Yes, very big. I have, maybe to round up, I have one last question, which is from Michael Derek, the last person I interviewed. I told him, could you maybe have a question for you as well? So I have written it up here. So this relates to that other podcast episode, Happiness and Genetics. So this way I can say if people want to hear even more philosophy. So his question is, and it has to do with genetics. Do you think that future generations will alter the genome of humans with genetic engineering technologies? And if so, in which direction will we steer our evolution, and what might the implications be? I guess we need another episode to cover this, but maybe...
Exactly. Well, I guess what I'm interested in, I'm much more interested in ways in which we're already now altering the genetic footprint of future generations, not so much through direct interventions such as genomic modifications, CRISPR-Cas or anything like that, but actually by altering chemically the environment we live in. So the fact that we are regularly exposed to toxins, to different kinds of environmental stressors on a daily basis, that we've radically altered the environment and the kind of chemicals that we encounter on an everyday basis, certainly in the Western world, but really all over the place at this point, all over the planet. And we've altered the atmosphere we live in, and we've altered many of the living conditions for us as organisms on the planet. I think that's already engendering genetic changes, and it's certainly engendering epigenetic changes in the ways in which our bodies respond to our living conditions. And that is, so that is something which is not a hopeful tale, as many people would see it, that, oh well, isn't that great that within 15 years we'll have the capacity to alter our bodies to suit our environments better. I think what we're actually doing is we are producing environments which are increasingly unlivable by organisms like us. Biology has the beautiful characteristics, of course, for all the reasons that we know, of being extremely adaptable, and so our bodies are trying to very quickly catch up with this and try and adapt our organisms generation after generation so that we can survive better under the present conditions, be more resistant to particular toxins, be better adapted to particular climates, and so on and so forth. But as we are clearly seeing at the moment, the pace of this kind of evolution or adaptation is much slower than the pace at which we are actually changing living conditions on the planet. So I would say these are the kind of genetic changes that I'll be particularly mindful of, that I think should be studied much better. There is of course a lot of interest in this, but at the moment it's also extremely politically unpalatable. Many people don't want to discuss things in those terms. I think that's an enormous mistake, and that's actually where a lot of our research should go. because trying to understand, in fact, how human beings and other creatures on the planet can withstand the type of living conditions we as humans are creating at the moment is the big scientific question.
We see the pollen decline, we see so
exactly.
many...
So these are the things I'm interested in. I know that there are people that sometimes call themselves transhumanists that are much more interested in trying to think about how you can use the latest gadget to make human life better in bizarre ways, like living forever or things that are totally unsustainable, but they find very attractive. I have zero interest in these kind of approaches. I just don't think they're either particularly tenable nor in any way sustainable. I think even if some people may arrive at that kind of approach, it would be in an incredibly exclusive and divided situation where only 0.00001% of the population of the planet will have access to such technologies and modifications, which means they're almost certainly bound to be like hugely harmful, generally speaking, to the human species and to the rest of the population. So, I don't have a lot of time and admiration for this particular way of focusing our thinking.
Yes.
While I think there's a lot to be said about how we can use our knowledge of genetics, our knowledge of biological adaptation and development in general to try and make life better for creatures on this planet altogether.
For me, maybe there's just one change that I would make, and that is 1 out of 2 doesn't have the receptor sensitive to caffeine and they can sleep at night. So in that case, I could have enjoyed a caffeinated coffee, but I'm very grateful that you asked the decaffeinated because I usually don't drink caffeinated coffee either.
There you go. And definitely intolerant to caffeine, so I will never sleep again.
You can drink this at any moment. There's still a very tiny amount of caffeine in here, but many thanks.
Thank you very, very much
for this very interesting discussion. As we wrap up, I would just ask you to still write a question for the next philosopher that I get to interview. So thank you, Sabina. Many thanks also to you having followed our discussion for, I think it's now reaching, I have no clue, more than an hour in any case. So many thanks, hope to see you on a next episode.
Thank you.